In the quiet blackness between stars, far beyond the warmth of any sun, there drifted an object so unremarkable in shape that it might have remained forever invisible. It was not majestic like a planet, nor bright like a star, nor even commanding like the spiral arms of a galaxy. It was a silent wanderer, a fragment of something older than memory, and yet, by chance, it was destined to pass near Earth's small and fragile system. For centuries, perhaps millennia, it had been gliding through interstellar void, indifferent to the civilizations that would one day notice it. It was small enough to be missed, yet large enough to leave a trace, and when the telescopes of Earth first caught the faint signature of reflected light from its icy surface, scientists knew immediately that it was not bound to the Sunday. This was no ordinary comet, it was Interstellar, the third such visitor ever observed, catalogued hastily, and given a name that would grow heavy with dread. 3I divided by Atlas. From the start, 3I divided by Atlas felt different. Its arc across the sky was not as sharp as Borisov's, nor as perplexingly angled as Oumuamua's. Instead, it slid into observation slowly, almost reluctantly, like a shadow revealed in dim light. Astronomers who tracked its trajectory late into the night spoke quietly of its path, noting that while its orbit confirmed an interstellar origin, its surface brightness betrayed a mystery. It glowed more than it should have, reflecting not just sunlight but some internal radiance that was hard to quantify. Some dismissed it as a trick of the instruments, calibration errors, or the illusions of tired eyes. Yet the glow persisted, subtle but undeniable, hinting at something unusual buried beneath its crust. Those first nights after discovery were filled with subdued wonder. Around the world, observatories trained their glass eyes toward the distant speck, collecting light and turning photons into data streams. The name Atlas came from the Hawaii-based survey telescope that spotted it, but the name itself seemed fateful, as if the comet carried the weight of worlds upon its narrow shoulders. Teams across Europe, Asia, and the Americas logged its speed, its shifting coma. The slender tail, it began to unfurl as solar winds whispered against its frozen skin. Journal articles were drafted quickly, speculations published faster than data could be verified, for in the world of interstellar objects, time was scarce. Once such a visitor passed, it was gone forever, never to return. Yet Atlas did not behave as it should have. Within days, researchers noted small discrepancies, slight accelerations inconsistent with pure gravitational pull. Outgassing could explain such nudges, the jets of sublimating ice acting like miniature thrusters. But the pattern here was irregular. It did not match the predictable spasms of water or carbon dioxide sublimation. Instead, it carried a rhythm, almost like a pulse, a faint but measurable sequence that seemed to repeat every few hours. Some dismissed it, cautious not to ignite the flames of speculation that had plagued Oumuamua. But others lingered on the data, staring at the curves of acceleration plotted against time, unsettled by the suggestion that the comet was not merely a drifting stone. For now, the world outside the astronomical community remained ignorant. Newspapers ran short blurbs, calling it a new interstellar comet, with accompanying artist renderings of a dirty snowball trailing a bluish tail. Social media barely noticed, except for a handful of skywatchers who posted grainy telescope captures. Among the scientists, however, a subtle tension began to grow. The comet was still far, weeks away from its closest pass to Earth, yet already it behaved like a riddle. Graduate students found themselves restless at their desks, watching numbers flicker across their screens. Professors argued in hallways over whether funding should be diverted toward a crash observational campaign. The night skies had offered humanity a fleeting chance, and no one wished to squander it. In conference calls spanning continents, voices carried excitement and unease in equal measure. A senior astrophysicist in Chile remarked, "It does not belong here, but it acts as though it remembers something." A younger researcher in Japan countered, "We cannot speak of memory in rocks." The silence that followed was heavy, for both knew that such language, poetic though it was, edged toward forbidden territory, toward the unprovable speculation that had turned respectable colleagues into fringe figures after Oumuamua. Science demanded restraint, demanded skepticism, demanded patience, and yet patience was difficult in the face of a comet that seemed to whisper back when studied. The skies remained indifferent, but the data accumulated. Night after night, telescopes measured the wanderer's glow. The patterns grew clearer, the pulse stronger, and the question, What exactly is 3I divided by Atlas? Began to weigh upon those who dared to ask. It was silent in the heavens, yes, but within that silence was a resonance, a story waiting to break open. And already, though no one would yet admit it, there were whispers in observatories, quiet mutterings of fear disguised as curiosity, that perhaps the silent wanderer was not silent at all, but waiting. The discovery of 3I divided by Atlas did not occur in isolation. Its presence brought with it the inevitable echoes of the past, the lingering shadows of two other interstellar visitors that had once brushed against humanity's understanding of the cosmos. In the conference rooms where astronomers now whispered, the names of those past wanderers hung in the air like ghosts. Oumuamua and Borisov. Each had left behind mysteries unresolved, questions uncomfortably suspended between science and wonder. And now, Atlas seemed to arrive not merely as another chance encounter, but as a continuation, as if the universe had opened a new chapter in a story still unfinished. It was in October of 2017 that the first such visitor had come, christened Oumuamua, the scout from afar. Unlike any comet or asteroid seen before, it was long, slender, and strangely featureless, reflecting sunlight in ways that defied explanation. Its acceleration could not be fully attributed to outgassing, and yet no coma, no fuzzy halo of evaporating ice was ever observed. Debate flared, then calcified. Some dared to call it an alien probe, a shard of technology drifting silently across interstellar distances, perhaps abandoned, perhaps sent deliberately. Others scoffed, pointing to the danger of imagination unmoored from evidence. But even those skeptics could not shake the unease that something about Oumuamua refused to fit into neat categories. It had come, it had passed, and then it was gone, a visitor who left behind only confusion and silence. Then came Borisov in 2019, a comet far more familiar in appearance. Unlike Oumuamua, it bore the classic traits of a comet, a nucleus of ice and rock, a halo, a tail stretching under solar winds. Yet even Borisov carried secrets. Its chemical composition was unlike any comet of the solar system, rich in molecules unseen in local samples. For astronomers, Borisov was a comfort. It resembled what they expected, a reminder that interstellar wanderers could still be ordinary, natural products of alien systems. And yet, in its ordinariness, it also emphasized the strangeness of Oumuamua. If Borisov was typical, then why was Oumuamua so alien? The two stood side by side in the annals of discovery, one too strange, the other too normal, both incomplete. So when 3I divided by Atlas emerged, the scientific world instinctively compared it to its predecessors. At first glance, it appeared more like Borisov, a cometary body with activity visible even at great distances. But its brightness, its pulse, its irregular trajectory, these qualities set it apart. Some dared to wonder if Atlas was the missing link between the two. Neither wholly incomprehensible, nor wholly ordinary, but something in between. A bridge, perhaps, or a correction, sent to remind humanity that the story of interstellar objects was not finished with two chapters. In observatories, there was a sense of recurrence, as if each generation of astronomers was destined to face the same riddle, dressed in new form. Senior scientists recalled the media frenzy over Oumuamua's supposed alien origin, and the cautious relief when Borisov reassured the world with its familiar cometary shape. Yet Atlas offered no reassurance. Instead, it stirred an unease that could not be dismissed, because its behavior carried echoes of both predecessors. The unpredictable acceleration of Oumuamua, the cometary glow of Borisov, and something else besides something entirely its own. Students entering the field in the wake of these discoveries felt as though they had inherited a legacy of uncertainty. For them, interstellar visitors were not curiosities but enigmas, each one threatening to overturn the foundations of astronomy. In their lecture halls, professors spoke with careful restraint, warning against speculative leaps, but their eyes betrayed an excitement and a fear they could not fully hide. To be alive in this era meant watching the cosmos whisper secrets faster than humanity could record them. It meant knowing that each discovery risked unraveling the fragile thread of certainty upon which science balanced. And so, Atlas became part of a lineage. Its very name invoked weight, as though it carried on its back the unresolved mysteries of the two that came before. To study it was to revisit Oumuamua's strange silence, to re-examine Borisov's alien chemistry, to stitch together fragments of a puzzle whose image was still incomplete. In private, a few wondered aloud whether these visitors were connected, not random wanderers, but part of some greater pattern, their timing not coincidental but deliberate. Such thoughts were dangerous, relegated to the margins of conversation, but they lingered nonetheless. As telescopes recorded Atlas's light, comparisons to past visitors sharpened. Some scientists insisted that history was repeating, another natural body, another brief fascination that would fade. Others leaned closer to the data, searching for threads that tied these encounters together. The echoes of past visitors did not fade with time. They grew louder, pressing against the present, urging those who watched to admit what they feared, that perhaps humanity had been noticed, and that these wanderers were not merely accidents of cosmic drift, but emissaries. And as 3I divided by Atlas slid silently through the heavens, the memory of Oumuamua and Borisov haunted every discussion, every plot of light curves, every jittering signal on the monitors. It was as though the universe itself were telling a story in fragments, and the astronomers on Earth were struggling to decipher the language before the next piece was lost forever to the dark. The early days of 3I divided by Atlas's observation had been filled with cautious excitement, but as the weeks passed and more data streamed in, that excitement gave way to unease. It began quietly, with whispered conversations in the corners of observatories, murmured doubts in dim control rooms lit only by the glow of monitors. On paper, Atlas was a comet, behaving like a comet should, shedding dust and gas as it neared the faint touch of the sun's warmth. Yet beneath the surface of the data, something refused to align with known patterns. It glowed too brightly, pulsed too consistently, and its coma was far too volatile for the amount of solar heating it received. These were not anomalies one could dismiss with the sweep of a hand. They were questions, sharp and insistent, pressing themselves into the minds of those who dared to look too closely. At the University of Cambridge, a graduate student named Eliza sat before her screen long past midnight, her eyes dry from staring at data streams. She traced the irregular accelerations of the comet with her finger, whispering to herself as if by speaking the numbers aloud she might tame them. Every model she ran, every simulation she adjusted, failed to capture the rhythm. Outgassing jets should sputter unpredictably, flaring when solar heat found hidden pockets of ice, then quieting when exhausted. But Atlas did not sputter, it pulsed, with intervals that verged on regularity. She shared her plots with her advisor, who frowned deeply, then told her not to mention the pattern in any formal meeting until they had more evidence. "The last thing we need," he said, "is another round of alien probe headlines." Eliza nodded, but the unease clung to her, burrowing deeper as each new night's data confirmed the rhythm. Across the ocean, in a control room at Mauna Kea, a team of astronomers gathered around their terminal. The comet's coma appeared unusually fragmented, with sudden bursts of dust that shimmered and dissipated in ways that suggested a violent instability beneath the surface. One researcher leaned back in his chair, muttering that it looked less like natural sublimation and more like controlled venting, as though something within was releasing pressure deliberately. The others shushed him, though not out of disagreement. They, too, had seen the strangeness, but none dared to voice aloud the conclusions their imaginations sketched. Science required caution, and caution often meant silence. Yet silence could not smother unease forever. Rumors began to circulate. A leaked internal memo from an observatory in South America hinted at data inconsistencies being redacted before publication. An email chain, later shared anonymously, suggested that certain government agencies had requested private access to raw data streams from Atlas, bypassing academic channels. Most dismissed these rumors as paranoia conspiracies blossoming in the fertile soil of mystery, but the whispers lingered nonetheless. Atlas was beginning to attract not just scientists, but watchers of a different kind, the type who dealt less in discovery and more in control. For the young researchers, the weight of unease grew heavy. They were taught to chase wonder, to marvel at the cosmos, but wonder here was threaded with dread. What if Atlas was not a simple visitor? What if its arrival was not random? The questions did not fade when they left the observatories. They followed them into their sleep, shaping dreams of glowing fragments, tearing silently across the night sky. Some woke in cold sweats, convinced they had heard the comet's pulse in their own veins. In the academic journals, meanwhile, the tone remained carefully measured. Phrases like anomalous brightness variations and uncharacteristic outgassing patterns filled the abstracts, hiding the fear beneath layers of sterile language. Peer reviewers struck through anything that hinted at speculation, demanding revisions that stripped the heart from the findings. But between the lines, the unease persisted. It clung to every chart, every dataset, every whisper in the corridors after lectures ended. The public remained largely oblivious, but among those who watched the skies for a living, a shadow had fallen. Atlas was no longer just a comet. It was a question mark writ large across the heavens, one that no one felt ready to answer. Scientists who had once approached the night with awe now approached it with hesitation, fearing what the next observation might reveal. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when only the machines hummed and the data continued its relentless arrival, a thought grew like a chill in the bones of those who studied it. Perhaps this was not a comet at all, but something else entirely, wearing the mask of ice and dust. And so, the whispers spread from observatory to observatory, from student to professor, from email to encrypted message. They carried unease like a contagion, invisible yet inescapable. Atlas was not silent anymore. It had begun to speak, not with words, but with patterns that pierced through the veil of reason, demanding attention, demanding fear. The unease surrounding 3I divided by Atlas might have remained an undercurrent, confined to the cautious words of scientists and the quiet fears of students, had it not been for the sudden appearance of files that were never meant to see daylight. They arrived not with an announcement, but in a ripple across private forums and encrypted servers, where amateur astronomers and disillusioned professionals alike shared scraps of data. A compressed archive, anonymous in origin, appeared one night with a subject line that read simply, "The Truth About Atlas." At first, most dismissed it as another conspiracy hoax. The age of the internet had made such leaks plentiful grand claims, with no evidence, wild speculation dressed up in jargon. But this archive was different. Within it were raw observational logs from observatories around the world, some tagged with metadata suggesting they were internal files never released publicly. There were notes from closed meetings, audio transcripts hastily typed by someone with access to the inner circle of astrophysics councils, and there were images, high-resolution captures of Atlas's coma showing strange filaments arcing from its core, structures too symmetrical to dismiss as noise. The files were not polished. They were chaotic, messy, filled with half-completed analyses and fragments of thought. But the pattern was clear enough. Certain datasets that had been presented to the public as inconclusive had in fact shown marked irregularities, only to be edited down before release. Reports described electromagnetic surges detected alongside optical data, signals that should not have existed in tandem with cometary activity. In one particularly damning note, a senior scientist wrote, "We are observing coherence. This is not random noise. Recommend suppression until a consensus strategy is developed." Of lots to the wash, and for the handful of researchers who stumbled across the leak in those early hours, the revelation was devastating. It confirmed what they had whispered in hallways, that something was being hidden. The suppression was not total. Enough data trickled through official channels to keep the academic machine turning. But the files revealed a second layer, one where uncomfortable truths were buried beneath the need for stability, for order, for control of the narrative. Within days, the archive spread further, copied and recopied until it reached communities of amateur astronomers who lacked institutional restraints. They pored over the data with obsessive focus, unburdened by the fear of reputational collapse. They cross-checked the irregularities, confirmed the pulse patterns, and began to publish their own unofficial reports. What institutions had carefully phrased as anomalous variations, they now called openly signals. The term electrified discussions, sparking debates in online forums that grew fevered with speculation. Was Atlas emitting controlled bursts? Was it masking itself as a comet while broadcasting? Governments began to take notice. At first, the response was subtle, quiet takedown requests of certain forums, accounts locked without explanation, domain names suspended, but the files had already slipped into the wild. Every attempt at suppression only fueled more suspicion, convincing even the skeptical that there was indeed something to hide. A few journalists caught wind and attempted to investigate, but their stories were buried under editorial hesitations, their editors pressured by unnamed sources to wait, to hold off, to not ignite panic without official confirmation. Meanwhile, in the observatories, tension boiled. Junior researchers, aware of the leaks, began to challenge their superiors more openly. Why had the data been edited? Why had meetings been held behind closed doors? Why were certain agencies attending calls that had nothing to do with academic science? Senior figures, cornered, responded with weary authority, speaking of responsibility, of the need to prevent hysteria. "We must be careful," they said, though the words sounded more like "we must obey." The files revealed something else, too. References to precursor anomalies. Notes hinted at events centuries past. Observations buried in old astronomical records that bore uncanny resemblance to Atlas's current behavior. A comet described in an 18th century journal, seen glowing with unnatural intensity before fragmenting. A tale from a Chinese astronomer about a wandering star that beat like a heart. These fragments, scattered across history, had been collected in secret, suggesting that Atlas was not the first of its kind to shake the foundations of certainty. Now, with the hidden files laid bare, the whispers of unease transformed into something sharper, something angrier. It was no longer just the fear of what Atlas might be, but the growing realization that truths had been withheld deliberately. The comet was not just an object under study, it had become a fault line between knowledge and secrecy, between curiosity and control. And as more people accessed the leaked archive, the story of Atlas began to fracture. For some, it was still a comet, extraordinary but natural. For others, it had become a cipher, a message, perhaps even a vessel. And above it all, in the cold silence of space, Atlas continued its journey, pulsing faintly as though mocking the chaos it had unleashed on Earth. The files were only the beginning. The true revelation, the true terror, had yet to arrive. By the time the leaked files had circulated through underground channels and ignited debates in hushed tones, the atmosphere within the observatories had shifted. No longer was the nightly ritual of watching 3 divided by Atlas carried by excitement or wonder. It was weighted with strain. For the researchers tasked with recording its every flicker of light, the comet was no longer just a celestial object. It was a burden, a test of endurance that pressed on the mind and body alike, eroding sleep, feeding doubt, and stirring fear that no one dared voice in the open. At the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, a small group gathered nightly to monitor incoming feeds. Their days blurred into one another, broken only by the quiet chime of new data packets arriving. Among them was a young postdoc named Ravi, who had once dreamed of discovering something like this, a traveler from beyond the stars, a relic of distant suns. But now his face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot from endless hours spent checking and rechecking figures that refused to align with the laws he had studied all his life. He muttered to himself as he recalculated acceleration vectors, hoping that one pass through the equations would smooth away the rhythm that haunted the data. But it remained, insistent, like a heartbeat echoing faintly through the silence of space. In Chile, high atop the Atacama Desert, the strain manifested in different ways. Eliza, the graduate student who had first noticed the pulse pattern, found herself waking in the middle of the night, certain that she had heard the rhythm in her dreams. She began to carry a notebook everywhere, sketching spirals, dots, lines, images she could not explain, drawn from an urgency she could not resist. When her advisor asked about her notes, she shrugged them off as just doodles, though her hands trembled when she closed the book. The pulse was no longer just in the data, it had begun to seep into her thoughts, invading her subconscious like an infection. Around the world, similar stories unfolded. Researchers spoke of headaches that sharpened whenever they worked near live feeds of Atlas's emissions. Technicians reported power fluctuations in equipment timed strangely with the comet's pulsing. Astronomers who once loved the night sky confessed to their partners that they no longer wanted to look up. Watching Atlas had become a burden, a task that weighed heavier with every night, as though the act of observation itself tethered the object closer to their minds. The leaked files only deepened the strain. Now, every anomalous flicker of data came with the suspicion of censorship. Was this observation genuine, or had someone altered it before reaching their screen? Were the reports they submitted being filed honestly, or quietly buried in a drawer of classified documents? The work of science thrived on trust. Trust in instruments, trust in data, trust in colleagues. But Atlas corroded that trust, replacing it with paranoia. Teams that once worked in harmony now splintered, some arguing fiercely for transparency, others insisting on discretion. Voices rose in meetings, tempers frayed, and friendships cracked beneath the weight of what Atlas might represent. Governments, too, applied pressure. In several countries, researchers reported unmarked officials visiting observatories, asking questions that veered uncomfortably close to threats. "You should not speculate publicly," they were told. "Do not encourage hysteria." And though no one said it outright, the message was clear: do your work, but do not think too loudly. For many young scientists, this was the cruelest cut of all, not that the comet was strange, but that their curiosity was being strangled by the very institutions that had once nurtured it. The strain seeped into their homes. Partners noticed the distance, the sleeplessness, the sudden silences at dinner tables. Children asked why their parents were always angry, always tired. The comet was millions of kilometers away, yet it reached into bedrooms, into kitchens, into dreams, pulling at the fragile threads of ordinary life. Some tried to step away, to take breaks, to let others shoulder the load. But each time they returned, the pulse was stronger, the data stranger, and the strain deeper. And through it all, Atlas drifted closer. It was indifferent to the sleepless nights it caused, to the whispers and paranoia it stirred. It did not care for the human exhaustion unraveling beneath its watch. In the silence of the void, it pulsed on, steady and patient, as though it knew that the strain it inflicted was only the beginning, that what was coming would break far more than the spirits of a few weary astronomers. The strain that had spread among researchers was soon matched by another, more tangible pressure: the failure of instruments. Telescopes, satellites, and sensitive detectors that had been trained upon 3I, divided by Atlas for weeks, began to show signs of strain themselves, as though the object in the sky was pressing not only on human minds but on the machines built to watch it. The first reports were subtle, strange spikes of noise in radio spectrographs, readings that spiked above background levels without clear source, detectors registering brief saturations. At first, these were blamed on solar interference or routine technical malfunctions. But as the days passed, the irregularities sharpened into a pattern, aligned disturbingly with the comet's rhythm. At the Deep Space Network facility in Goldstone, engineers watched their consoles with growing alarm. A feed from a tracking dish went dark for several minutes, not because of weather or hardware failure, but because the signal had been overwhelmed. One technician described it as though something out there shouted into the dish, a burst of energy that swamped the receivers and left the equipment momentarily blind. When the system rebooted, the graphs displayed a residual echo, a strange curve that resisted classification. They logged it as interference, but no one could say from where. Meanwhile, in orbit, satellites began to misbehave. The Solar and Heliospheric Observatory recorded streams of charged particles inconsistent with the Sun's activity, seemingly emanating from the direction of Atlas itself. Communications satellites near Earth reported minor fluctuations, brief, unexplained packet losses that engineers struggled to replicate in simulation. Some whispered about electromagnetic pulses, localized bursts aligned with the comet's pulse, as though it were releasing more than light and dust into the void. At Arecibo's successor facilities, still scarred from the collapse of the Great Dish, the new generation of radio telescopes attempted to scan Atlas for emissions. What they found unsettled them further. Narrowband signals, fleeting and faint, but structured. The researchers argued bitterly over whether these were artifacts of faulty processing. The official reports, carefully worded, referred to non-random interference, but the private notes told another story. One entry read, "It is as if the object hums, the instruments hum back." For the scientists closest to the data, the overload was more than technical, it was personal. Hours spent staring at screens that flickered with inexplicable bursts left them drained, their senses dulled. Some reported phantom noises, high-pitched tones in their ears, even when the instruments were powered down. Others claimed to feel vibrations through the floor, pulses that matched the comet's rhythm. The line between mechanical error and psychological toll blurred. Was it the machines breaking, or the people? Perhaps both. Governments, once more, took interest. Engineers were quietly instructed to classify malfunctions, to attribute failures to routine cosmic noise. Yet the pattern could not be hidden for long. Amateur radio astronomers, armed with modest backyard dishes, began reporting the same pulses. They uploaded recordings that, when played back, carried an uncanny cadence, like static molded into rhythm. The public was told these were misinterpretations, yet the consistency across continents defied such dismissals. The overload spread further still. In labs where the data was analyzed, Computers began to crash under mysterious conditions. Graphing software froze when attempting to plot certain intervals, as though the data itself resisted visualization. Corrupt files, the IT team said, but researchers swore the data had been clean until the comet's pulse passed through. One physicist, exhausted and trembling, muttered to a colleague that Atlas seemed to know when it was being watched, and still, the object drifted onward. Its glow intensified, its coma rippled with invisible storms, and the rhythm pulsed steady. The instruments, designed to withstand the chaos of the cosmos, bent beneath its influence, strained to their limits, some collapsing into silence. To the weary watchers, it felt as though Atlas was testing them, probing not only their machines but their resolve, pressing on every boundary of knowledge, daring them to admit that what they faced was no longer a comet, no longer something they understood. The overload was not just a technical anomaly, it was a warning. And though no one yet dared to say it aloud, the scientists who sat before their failing instruments knew in their bones that something was coming, and that when it arrived, no machine on Earth would be strong enough to bear witness unscathed. By the time instruments across continents had begun to stagger beneath the weight of Atlas's strange emissions, the sense of dread had spread beyond the labs and observatories into the very fabric of the scientific world. It was no longer just one nation's concern, no longer confined to hushed academic circles. It had become a planetary fixation. The surge was building, not merely in electromagnetic signatures or visual brightness, but in the minds of those who lived under its silent presence. Every night, the comet grew brighter, its coma spreading wider like a wound opening in the heavens. To the untrained eye, it was beautiful. To those who studied it, it was terrifying. Telescopes reported its outbursts increasing in frequency. Dust plumes exploded from its surface with alarming violence, shimmering through the void before dissipating into trails that twisted unnaturally against the solar wind. Its light curve climbed sharply, far beyond what models predicted. A comet should brighten smoothly as it approached the sun, but Atlas flared like a heartbeat, sometimes dimming as though it recoiled, then surging with brilliance that made detectors shiver. The pattern was unmistakable now. It was not random. Something beneath the surface was building toward release. In a tense midnight meeting streamed between observatories in Hawaii, Chile, and Europe, researchers debated what they were seeing. A senior astronomer from the Canary Islands broke the silence. "We are watching a destabilization. This is no longer a question of whether it will fragment. The question is when." His words fell like stones in water, sending ripples of fear across the faces in their video feeds. Fragmentation was common for comets under solar stress, but this had the cadence of inevitability, as though Atlas was following a script written in forces unknown. And then came the surges in radiation. Detectors in orbit picked up sudden spikes of energy that could not be explained by solar activity. These bursts arrived in sequence, aligned once again with the comet's pulse, carrying frequencies that bordered dangerously close to coherent patterns. Engineers at NASA warned of possible effects on satellites if the emissions intensified. The European Space Agency reported brief communication blackouts with probes in deep space, anomalies they carefully labeled environmental disturbances in public releases. Privately, however, memos described them as direct responses from Atlas, as though the object was not simply expelling matter, but interacting. The surge did not go unnoticed by those outside the scientific establishment. News outlets picked up scattered threads from amateur astronomers who had noticed the irregularities, and speculation began to seep into the public sphere. Was this comet a threat? Could it explode? Was Earth in danger? Government spokespeople scrambled to calm the panic, repeating phrases about expected fragmentation and no risk to our planet. But the tone of their reassurance felt brittle, rehearsed, as if even they no longer believed the words. Among the watchers, fatigue turned into obsession. Eliza, who had first traced the pulse, now marked each surge with frantic energy, her notebook filled with sketches that grew more elaborate, less like doodles and more like diagrams. Ravi, across the ocean, abandoned his sleep schedule entirely, existing in a haze of coffee and numbers, his voice hoarse from muttering calculations that refused to hold. Around them, colleagues spoke less of natural processes and more of inevitability. Something was coming, something no one could stop, and the comet seemed to know it. In the silence of space, Atlas grew restless. Its glow sharpened, casting a faint green hue across photographs that deepened night after night. Its coma stretched wider, fracturing into strange filaments that looked less like dust clouds and more like tendrils. The surge built, not with suddenness, but with the slow patience of a storm gathering far out at sea, each wave higher, each gust stronger, until all who watched could feel the pressure rising. And beneath the growing weight of that pressure, humanity itself seemed to lean forward, waiting for the inevitable break. The world had lived through comets before, had seen them burn and fracture, but never one like this. Never one that pulsed with rhythm, that hummed with signals, that strained the machines and the minds of those who dared to watch. The surge was building, and all anyone could do was wait for it to break. The build-up to the moment of rupture was agonizing, stretched across weeks of sleepless observation and mounting dread. Each surge had come stronger than the last, like a drumbeat echoing through the void, warning of what could no longer be denied. And then, without fanfare, without countdown, 3I divided by Atlas reached its breaking point. It happened in silence, as all cosmic catastrophes do. Space does not allow sound, only light and radiation. And so, when the comet's heart tore itself apart, Earth's first witnesses were not human eyes but the machines that watched for us. The flash was sudden, blinding in its intensity, a burst that outshone the predictions of even the most extreme models. For a fleeting moment, Atlas rivaled the brilliance of planets, a green-white wound in the heavens visible even through modest backyard telescopes. The rupture began at the nucleus, splitting the icy body into fragments that flew outward in arcs, too deliberate to be dismissed as random. Dust exploded into a halo, scattering across the void, expanding in a wave of shimmering debris. To the naked eye, it was as though a star had blossomed and died in an instant. But for the instruments trained upon it, the event was far more complex. Detectors registered bursts of radiation that defied cometary physics. Instead of the expected scatter of sublimated gases, they recorded coherent spikes across multiple wavelengths, almost like coded bursts. Radio dishes were swamped with signals that hummed with unnatural symmetry. Arecibo's successors, the VLA, and amateur operators alike, captured narrowband transmissions hidden within the static. "It's talking," one technician whispered, unable to stop himself, though he knew how ridiculous it sounded. Yet the data carried a pattern, and the pattern carried intent. At the moment of flash, power grids in several regions flickered. Satellites in orbit recorded momentary blackouts. Space weather monitors, designed to measure solar flares, trembled with readings that dwarfed anything the sun had released in decades. For a few moments, humanity's fragile electronic web shivered as though brushed by the comet's dying breath. And yet, even in its death, Atlas seemed anything but gone. The fragments shot outward in silence, dozens of jagged shards glowing with residual heat and energy. They trailed streams of dust like luminous veins, carving new paths across the solar system. Astronomers who had stared at screens until their eyes burned now blinked in disbelief at the splintered remains, unsure whether to weep or cheer. Some cheered at the beauty, the sheer majesty of celestial destruction. Others wept at the fear of what those fragments might yet bring. For the public, the event became a spectacle. Amateur skywatchers posted photographs of the sudden brightening, social media erupting with awestruck captions about the exploding comet. News networks scrambled to cover it, anchors fumbling to explain the unexpected brilliance. Yet the truth of what had happened, the unnatural signals, the deliberate geometry of the fragmentation remained carefully hidden. Official statements framed it as a natural cometary breakup, no different than those witnessed before. But among the scientific community, those words felt hollow. The sudden flash was not merely destruction, it was revelation. The rhythm that had haunted Atlas for weeks did not vanish with its disintegration. If anything, it intensified, now embedded in the paths of its fragments, the glow of its dust. Observatories recorded synchronized flickers across the shards, as though each piece carried a shard of memory, a fragment of something greater. Some spoke of it as an orchestra fragments playing in harmony, their pulses aligned in eerie precision. And for those who had followed the comet since its discovery, the moment of rupture confirmed what they had feared in their private thoughts. This was not random. It was not accident. The sudden flash was an act, a moment that felt less like a collapse and more like a message delivered with breathtaking violence. In the silence of the heavens, Atlas was no longer a wanderer. It had become a voice, and its first word was an explosion that shook not just instruments, not just data, but the very certainty with which humanity looked upon the stars. The flash was over, but its echo had only just begun. When Atlas erupted, the visible brilliance was only the beginning. What came next was not fire, nor flame, nor any thunder that human ears could hear. It was a shock wave that moved invisibly, silently, across the fabric of space, yet its fingerprints were everywhere. Instruments caught it first, recording distortions that could not be explained by dust or gas. The wave carried a signature that bent across multiple spectrums, touching radio, infrared, and high-energy bands with unnatural precision. It was as though the comet had sent a ripple through the vacuum itself, a wave without sound yet louder than anything humanity had ever known. In observatories around the globe, alarms tripped in cascading succession. Sensitive detectors went offline, not from mechanical failure but from saturation, overwhelmed by the sheer density of the signal. Computers froze mid-process, their processors struggling to translate numbers that refused to resolve into natural physics. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a young technician stared at her console, lips trembling, as her graph displayed a sudden spike. She whispered, "It's coherent. It's structured." Around her, the room fell silent as realization settled. This was no mere release of energy. The shockwave was patterned, ordered, something designed. But how could a comet design anything? The question spread like a contagion, unspoken yet heavy, lingering in the corners of every conversation. A shockwave of dust should scatter chaotically, a chaos of particles hurled into the void. Yet the dust trails from Atlas's fragments seemed to curve deliberately, intertwining into spirals that echoed geometry forms found not in nature, but in architecture. Images taken by high-powered telescopes revealed faint lattices within the expanding cloud, structures fleeting and fragile, yet undeniably intentional in their symmetry. Some argued it was pareidolia, the human brain finding patterns where none existed. Others knew better. The patterns were too precise, too repeated. This was no illusion. Even Earth itself seemed to feel the wave. Seismographs in remote locations registered faint tremors without geological cause. Magnetometers spiked in rhythms that echoed the comet's pulse. For a brief span of seconds, compasses in the Arctic wavered, their needles drawn slightly off course as if tugged by an invisible hand. Pilots flying transcontinental routes reported flickers in their instruments, the faint disruption of systems that had been stable for decades. These anomalies were small, fleeting, but together they painted a chilling picture. The shockwave was not limited to the heavens, it had touched Earth. Governments scrambled to contain the implications. Official channels labeled the disturbances as expected electromagnetic effects from cometary fragmentation. Yet the classified reports, already leaking into the hands of journalists and independent researchers, spoke otherwise. One passage read, "The structured wave cannot be reconciled with cometary physics. It is consistent with engineered emission. Implications, uncertain, potentially catastrophic." For the scientists closest to the data, the silence of the shockwave was perhaps the most unnerving part. There was no roar, no boom, no sound to accompany the destruction. It was silent as the grave, yet its effects echoed everywhere, as though the universe itself had shifted by a fraction. The silence gave it weight, an alien stillness that pressed on their minds, leaving them restless, haunted by the knowledge that something had reached across the void and touched them without a sound. Eliza, sitting alone in her dormitory, scrolled through the latest plots, her eyes wide and hollow. The pulses were still there, embedded in the fragments, but now there was something more, an overlay, a second rhythm, as if the shockwave itself carried a hidden code. She copied the sequence into her notebook, writing until her hand cramped. The symbols seemed to form shapes of their own accord, repeating, looping, spiraling outward. She shut the book quickly, afraid of what she was drawing. Around her, others felt it too. Ravi sat in his dim-lit office, staring at the afterglow of the comet's remains on his screen. He could not shake the thought that the explosion had not been a death but a birth. The shockwave not destruction but announcement. He felt sick at the idea, but it rooted itself firmly. Atlas had not simply died, it had declared itself, and still the world spun on, ordinary in its ignorance. Most people looked up at the glowing streaks in the night sky and saw beauty, fragments of a cosmic traveler breaking apart in splendor. They did not feel the silent pressure that weighed on the watchers, did not hear the unspoken dread in the voices of those who studied the signals. The shockwave in silence was invisible to them, and perhaps mercifully so. For those who knew, the silence was unbearable, the absence of sound a reminder that the universe had spoken in a language humanity was never meant to hear. In the wake of the silent shockwave, the world of science fractured into a cacophony of competing voices. What had once been a quiet unease whispered behind closed doors now erupted into heated arguments, wild speculations, and desperate attempts to frame the incomprehensible within human logic. For every cautious report carefully filed with understated terms like unexplained anomaly or unexpected coherence, there were a dozen voices outside the official channels, proclaiming bold, even outrageous interpretations of what 3I divided by Atlas's explosion had truly meant. The first and most obvious theory clung to familiarity. Atlas was still a comet, albeit an unstable one, its violent rupture, the product of volatile materials deep within its fractured core. Some argued that its strange emissions were the result of cryovolcanic vents firing in resonance, coincidentally producing rhythm-like pulses. They pointed to laboratory experiments on frozen gases under vacuum conditions, showing how sublimation could occur in periodic bursts. "Nature is stranger than we give it credit for," one scientist wrote in a prominent journal, though his tone seemed more like a plea than an explanation. But others were not satisfied with naturalistic answers. In online forums, in conference hallways, and even in hushed discussions during official briefings, theories unfurled with reckless abandon. The most sensational claimed that Atlas had been no comet at all, but an artificial construct, a vessel designed to mimic a natural body. Its sudden explosion was not decay, but detonation, the controlled release of energy, either accidental or deliberate. Advocates of this view pointed to the symmetry of the dust spirals, the coherent shockwave, and the pulses embedded in the fragments. "This is not random," they said. "This is a message." A second camp spoke in darker tones. They speculated that Atlas had been an interstellar weapon, dormant until proximity to the sun awoke it. The shockwave, they argued, was not communication but test fire, a display of power. Some went further, suggesting it had failed, its mission aborted by premature rupture. "What if?" one whispered during a tense meeting. "This was meant for us, but it broke before completion?" The silence that followed was suffocating, no one daring to answer. Others reached for wilder cosmological explanations. Some theorized Atlas carried antimatter deposits that destabilized upon heating, the shockwave a natural consequence of annihilation. A handful invoked exotic physics, dark matter reactions, quantum resonance, even miniature black holes hidden within its nucleus. These ideas spread quickly through the fringes, attracting attention less for their plausibility than for their drama. Humanity had always been hungry for stories of cosmic danger, and Atlas provided the perfect canvas for such tales. Among the most unsettling theories were those that looked backward rather than forward. The leaked files that hinted at precursor anomalies gained renewed attention, with researchers digging through centuries-old astronomical records. Patterns emerged, objects described as glowing, pulsing, breaking apart, then vanishing from sight. Ancient texts from Asia and Europe alike spoke of wandering stars that split like hearts, or green lanterns in the heavens that died with a silent clap. What if Atlas was not unique, but part of a cycle? What if others had come before, each leaving behind whispers, each ignored or forgotten until now? Governments, caught between the need to maintain order and the impossibility of suppressing every rumor, found themselves trapped in contradiction. Public statements reassured citizens that Atlas posed no threat, that its fragments would disperse harmlessly, that there was no reason for alarm. Yet behind the scenes, emergency meetings were held, strategies drafted, satellites repositioned, memos circulated with headings like potential information control and social panic containment. Theories ran wild because no single truth had been offered, and in the vacuum of silence, fear flourished. In the scientific community, reputations began to fray. Colleagues accused one another of recklessness, of overstepping evidence, of courting sensationalism. Friendships dissolved in heated arguments. For some, the explosion was proof of extraterrestrial intelligence, undeniable and final. For others, it was the latest in a string of overinterpretations, a mistake that would embarrass the field for decades. Yet even those who clung to caution could not escape the gnawing doubt that the universe had just revealed something beyond human comprehension. Eliza, scribbling in her notebooks, found herself torn between wonder and dread. The symbols she had drawn, unbidden, now resembled the dust spirals recorded after the explosion. She had not meant to copy them, they had simply emerged from her hand as though she already knew their form. When she showed them to Ravi during a late-night video call, his face paled. "It looks like an equation," he murmured. But when pressed, he could not say what it calculated. Theories ran wild, unchecked, each more fantastical than the last. Some offered comfort, others sowed terror, but none brought certainty. Atlas had exploded, yes, but in its silence, it had left behind something far more destabilizing than debris. It had left behind the absence of answers, a void into which human imagination now poured uncontrollably. And in that chaos of ideas, one truth became inescapable. Whatever Atlas was, it had changed the way humanity looked at the sky forever. The explosion of 3I divided by Atlas had left behind fragments, pulses, and silence that spoke louder than any roar. Yet for many in the scientific community, one question rose above all others. Where did it come from? If this object carried mysteries so profound, coherent shock waves, geometric dust trails, pulses embedded in its very destruction, then its origin mattered more than ever. And as astronomers turned their gaze backward, tracing the path of the wanderer through the endless night, they found themselves confronting contradictions that only deepened the mystery. Interstellar objects could be tracked, their orbits reconstructed by winding back the clock of their trajectory. With enough precision, one might identify the star system from which they had been ejected. It was difficult, prone to uncertainty, but not impossible. Teams across the globe set about running their models, using the pre-explosion path of Atlas to chart its long journey through the galaxy. They expected chaos, a range of possible origins spanning light years, narrowed by probability. Instead, what they found was something worse: patterns that refused to converge. In one model, Atlas seemed to have come from the direction of the constellation Lyra, near Vega, a bright beacon only 25 light-years away. In another, its path led to a dim, ancient red dwarf, whose planetary system was barely known. Still others traced it toward the galactic halo, a region where stars moved like wanderers themselves, unmoored and ancient. The results conflicted violently, diverging even when based on the same data sets. Some argued the explosion itself had skewed reconstructions, scattering its fragments in ways that muddied the path. But others whispered a different possibility, that the trajectory itself had been manipulated. Leaked memos hinted at this possibility more boldly. One, shared anonymously on a private astronomy forum, read, "Trajectory inconsistencies not attributable to observational error. Repeated attempts to resolve backward orbit produce non-physical outcomes. Conclusion: object did not follow natural path." If true, this suggested something chilling, that Atlas had not simply drifted from its home system by accident, but had been guided. Whether by natural forces unknown or by deliberate control, no one could say. But the idea itself was enough to send shivers down the spine of every scientist who dared to entertain it. The disputed origin drew attention beyond the scientific world. Ancient star maps, once relegated to dusty archives, were pulled out and examined with new urgency. A manuscript from medieval Persia described a wandering flame that crossed the sky and then burst into a crown of shards. Chinese records from the Tang dynasty spoke of a jade star that pulsed before dissolving. Scholars who had once dismissed these accounts as metaphor now reconsidered them. Could these reports have been earlier visitors, earlier Atlas-like objects? If so, where had they come from, and why now? Why again? Among the wildest theories, one gained quiet traction: that Atlas had not originated in any star system at all, but had been set adrift in interstellar space deliberately. Some described it as a messenger, an interstellar probe disguised as a comet, its origin point hidden precisely because it was never bound to a single system. Others called it a refugee, a broken shard of something greater that had wandered too far. Still others, darker in their imaginings, saw it as a weapon, ejected into the void to one day awaken in the presence of new suns. In the private corners of academia, debates turned vicious. At one closed symposium in Geneva, a renowned astrophysicist stood up and declared, "We cannot call this an accident anymore. To pretend otherwise is to blind ourselves." He was met with silence, followed by the quiet scraping of chairs as several colleagues left the room rather than hear such heresy spoken aloud. In another meeting, a younger researcher demanded to know why government representatives sat in on every discussion of Atlas's trajectory. "What are they afraid we will find?" she asked. No one answered her. For Ravi, the search for the origin became an obsession. He spent sleepless nights running simulations, tweaking variables, feeding in fragments of data. Each time, the models broke down, the comet's path scattering into absurdities. Finally, one night, he stared at the error readout and whispered, "It doesn't come from anywhere." The thought terrified him more than anything else. Objects had to come from somewhere. If Atlas didn't, what did that mean? Eliza, meanwhile, found herself drawn to the oldest star charts, tracing lines with trembling fingers. She noticed alignments no one else seemed to see, trajectories of ancient, wandering stars that mirrored Atlas's path almost exactly, as though it were part of a sequence repeating across centuries. She wanted to share her findings, but every time she raised the idea, her colleagues dismissed it as pattern-seeking. Still, she felt the truth pressing on her chest. Atlas was not alone. It never had been. The disputed origin became a wound in the fabric of science, tearing apart consensus and leaving only questions. It was not enough to know what Atlas was. Humanity needed to know where it came from, why it came, and whether more were following. The explosion had ended its journey through space, but in its wake, it left humanity staring backward into the galaxy, searching desperately for a birthplace that may never have existed at all. Even as the disputed origin of 3I divided by Atlas split the scientific community into factions, whispers from history began to re-emerge with unsettling clarity. For centuries, astronomers and chroniclers had recorded strange occurrences in the night sky, wandering stars that pulsed, glowed, or shattered without reason. Until recently, these accounts had been treated as curiosities, artifacts of cultures that clothed the heavens in myth. But in the shadow of Atlas's explosion, those forgotten records felt less like myth and more like warnings humanity had dismissed. It was Eliza who first connected the dots in earnest. In her sleepless nights, she combed through digitized archives of medieval manuscripts, ancient Chinese astronomy scrolls, and even Babylonian clay tablets that mapped the heavens. Again and again, she found descriptions that echoed the comet's behavior, objects described as breathing lights, wandering emeralds, or silent stars that broke apart like burning flowers. In one Persian manuscript, she found a chilling passage. The green wanderer came, it pulsed with the heart of a beast, and it split into shards that rained without sound. The elders said, "Beware, for this is no comet but a herald." How was Meshenromd? She presented her findings in a closed meeting, but her colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One muttered that such accounts were poetic exaggerations, not data. Another suggested she was grasping at coincidence. "History cannot be trusted in this way," her advisor said firmly. Yet when she showed the drawings, spirals and lines etched centuries apart, yet almost identical to the dust trails Atlas had produced, silence hung heavy in the room. No one dared to acknowledge the implication that humanity had been warned time and time again, and each warning had been ignored. Meanwhile, in the classified files leaked weeks earlier, references to these same records surfaced in the margins. Handwritten notes in the scanned pages suggested that governments had long been aware of the parallels, collecting accounts across cultures in secrecy. A document labeled only "Continuity of Anomalous Objects" listed events stretching back over 1,000 years, each noting a wandering star that appeared, pulsed, and vanished after fragmentation. The file concluded with a line redacted almost entirely, save for the words, "Pattern recurrence likely." Among those who saw the file, a grim theory began to take hold, that Atlas was not unique, not an anomaly, but part of a cycle. If so, then the silence of past centuries was not the silence of absence, but of ignorance. Humanity had seen this before and failed to recognize it, treating cosmic warnings as curiosities, mythologizing them until they became harmless stories. Now, with modern instruments capable of piercing the veil, there was no excuse for ignorance. Yet governments still moved to suppress, still tried to control the narrative. They, too, were ignoring the warning, perhaps deliberately. Publicly, the event was framed as a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle. News anchors smiled as they compared Atlas's flash to Halley's comet, assuring viewers that nothing about it posed danger. "A reminder of the beauty of space," one said, even as behind closed doors, agencies debated fragment trajectories with grim faces. The public believed the narrative, content to marvel at photographs of glowing debris. unaware that some fragments had already been observed heading inward toward the inner solar system. For the scientists, the warning grew harder to deny. The silent shockwave, the geometric trails, the coherent pulses, they all pointed to a pattern beyond natural explanation, and yet each attempt to sound the alarm was muffled. Journals rejected papers, labeling them speculative. Funding agencies pulled grants from projects deemed too sensational. In universities, young researchers were quietly advised to change focus, lest their careers be ruined. The machinery of science itself became complicit in ignoring the warning, enforcing silence through fear of ridicule. Ravi found himself spiraling under the weight of it. One night, staring at the trajectory plots of Atlas's fragments, he whispered to himself, "It's coming again. It always comes again." His colleagues dismissed him as exhausted, urging him to rest, but the conviction in his voice lingered, haunting those who had heard it. Eliza, too, felt the pressure, her notebooks filling with drawings she dared not share publicly. She knew what they resembled: patterns repeated across history, warnings humanity had buried. And so the warning of Atlas became one more ignored, just as warnings had been ignored for centuries. Humanity looked up and saw beauty, governments looked down and saw control, and scientists looked inward and saw fear. But in the cold silence of space, the fragments of Atlas still glowed, still pulsed, still moved in patterns too precise to dismiss. The warning was not over, it had only begun, and the price of ignoring it would soon be written not in manuscripts or whispers, but in fire across the skies of Earth. When 3I divided by Atlas shattered, it did not die. Instead, it multiplied. What had once been a single, pulsing wanderer now became dozens of glowing shards, each streaking into the void on a trajectory of its own. The initial brilliance of the flash faded, leaving behind trails of dust and debris that spread across the solar system like veins of light. To the casual eye, it was a beautiful spectacle, an interstellar comet breaking apart under the pressure of a nearby star. But for those who followed its path with instruments and models, the beauty was laced with dread. The fragments were not dispersing into harmlessness, they were moving with purpose. In the first weeks after the explosion, astronomers scrambled to track them. Each fragment became its own object of study, catalogued and numbered, though the task quickly proved overwhelming. Some shards were small, barely detectable specks of dust. Others were massive, glowing with strange luminescence. What unsettled observers most was the rhythm that persisted. Even separated, the fragments pulsed faintly, as though they still shared a heartbeat. They flickered in near unison, across millions of kilometers, in patterns that echoed the signals recorded before the comet's rupture. Telescopes captured images of fragments twisting as they moved, shedding dust that trailed behind them like luminous banners. But unlike ordinary cometary debris, these trails curved, looping into spirals and arcs that suggested geometry. Some even aligned in parallel, forming momentary patterns in the darkness. One image, captured by a European observatory, showed 4 fragments forming a near-perfect diamond before drifting apart. The photo was quickly classified, withheld from public release, but whispers of it circulated among scientists who had seen the raw data. "They're arranging themselves," one said, "not scattering, aligning." The trajectories themselves became a point of alarm. While many fragments drifted outward into the solar system, scattering harmlessly into the vastness, several took paths inward toward the orbit of Earth. At first, the probabilities of impact were calculated as infinitesimal, but with each new observation, the margins of error narrowed, and the numbers grew less comforting. Small fragments posed no threat, expected to burn harmlessly in the atmosphere, but a handful of larger shards, glowing stubbornly in telescopic images, seemed destined to pass close, too close for comfort. Governments quietly convened emergency sessions. Space agencies modeled potential impact scenarios, their simulations showing streaks of fire tearing through the sky, shock waves flattening cities, seas rising from displaced force. Yet the official statements remained calm. "There is no risk to Earth," they repeated, even as internal memos labeled certain fragments as objects of high concern. In underground bunkers, defense planners debated whether to attempt deflection, though no one could explain how one might deflect fragments that pulsed with coherent emissions and ignored natural expectations. For the scientists, the journey of the fragments became a nightmare of logistics. Each night brought new data, each day brought new calculations, and the fragments refused to behave. Some accelerated slightly, veering off predicted paths. Others slowed inexplicably, as though resisting gravitational pull. In one case, a fragment shifted course mid-observation, its new path aligning eerily with the trajectory of another shard, as though drawn together by invisible strings. Ravi, watching the plots unfold, muttered to himself, "They're not fragments, they're pieces of something still whole." Eliza's notebooks grew more frantic. She sketched the alignments, the spirals, the diamond formations. When overlaid, her drawings began to resemble patterns seen in ancient manuscripts, the same ones that described wandering stars splitting into shards. She saw in them not randomness, but repetition. History was repeating itself, the fragments following paths that others had traced centuries ago. Yet when she tried to share her work, her colleagues recoiled. "You're chasing ghosts," they said, though their eyes betrayed the same fear she felt. Meanwhile, the public marveled at the sight. Amateur astronomers captured long-exposure photographs of streaks across the sky, unaware that some of those streaks were headed closer than anyone dared admit. Online forums filled with awe-struck commentary about the beauty of the comet's ashes, while conspiracy corners spun tales of alien vessels disguised as rocks. Between wonder and paranoia, the truth remained obscured. But in observatories and government labs, the truth was unavoidable. The fragments were on the move, and their journey was not aimless. They carried the pulse of Atlas within them, a rhythm that echoed across millions of kilometers, binding them together like pieces of a shattered chorus. They glowed in patterns, shifted in alignments, and bent their paths as though guided by a memory older than stars. The fragments' journey had begun, and it was no longer a question of if they would reach Earth's neighborhood, but when and what would happen when they arrived. As the fragments of 3I divided by Atlas continued their unnerving journey, slipping silently through the solar system, with their eerie pulses and inexplicable alignments, the burden of truth shifted more heavily onto governments. The public, dazzled by photographs and reassurances, still saw beauty in the sky. But behind closed doors, in rooms with no windows and guarded by men who never gave their names, the story of Atlas was spoken in darker tones. What the world saw as a celestial marvel, governments recognized as a potential crisis, perhaps even a threat beyond anything Earth had faced before. Agencies across continents worked feverishly in secret. In Washington, London, Moscow, and Beijing, task forces assembled, bringing together astrophysicists, defense officials, intelligence officers, and analysts who spoke only in classified reports. These meetings carried a single, grim agenda: to determine whether Atlas had been natural or designed. Some voices still clung to the cometary explanation, arguing that extraordinary physics did not require extraordinary intent. But others pointed to the damning evidence: the coherent pulses, the geometric dust spirals, the fragments' deliberate alignments. "We cannot assume randomness," one official said during a late-night session, his voice tight with fear. "If this was built, then someone or something built it." The shadow of this possibility reached into military corridors. Defense departments drafted contingency plans under code names that never appeared in public documents. Radar arrays were recalibrated to track Atlas fragments alongside missiles. High-orbit satellites were tasked with monitoring them, transmitting streams of classified data into encrypted archives. In some corners of power, whispers of first contact scenarios surfaced, though these whispers were quickly drowned beneath louder debates about secrecy and control. For if Atlas was proof of something more, how could governments release that truth without collapsing the fragile structures of society? The choice, for them, was clear: conceal. Information was scrubbed before release, terms softened into benign phrases. Expected fragmentation, unusual but natural emissions, no risk to Earth. Behind those words were darker assessments, hidden in reports marked top secret, eyes only. These internal documents spoke of objects maintaining coherent trajectory despite gravitational perturbations, and fragments exhibiting synchronized emissions consistent with communication. Yet these truths remained buried, shared only among those who had sworn oaths of silence. Still, leaks persisted. A researcher in Europe passed encrypted files to a journalist, claiming that fragments were on paths intersecting Earth's orbit. In South America, an anonymous whistleblower uploaded classified trajectory simulations showing possible atmospheric entries within months. Each leak was swiftly discredited, the sources silenced, the documents dismissed as forgeries. But for those who had seen the data with their own eyes, the truth was undeniable. Governments knew more than they were saying. The secrecy seeped into the scientific community as well. Researchers who pressed too hard on anomalies found their projects defunded, their careers stalled. Young astronomers were warned not to publish certain findings, threatened with the end of their academic futures if they pursued irresponsible speculation. In some cases, observatories reported visits from officials who suggested changes to public-facing data. The watchers of the sky were becoming unwilling participants in a global cover-up. And yet, beneath the silence of suppression, fear grew. Not fear of panic among the public, though that was the excuse most often given, but fear of what the fragments themselves might mean. Were they simply debris, or were they carriers of something more, messengers seeded across the solar system, waiting for alignment? Officials argued deep into the night, their words laced with unease. Some advocated for transparency, insisting that humanity deserved to know what it faced. Others argued secrecy was mercy. If the truth was unbearable, why burden the world with it? But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. Amateur astronomers, immune to government directives, continued to track the fragments with their modest telescopes. They posted observations online, images of faint trails shifting in patterns too precise to be coincidence. One amateur in Australia even caught two fragments crossing paths in a maneuver that mirrored an earlier alignment, a ballet of debris too synchronized for chance. The images went viral before being dismissed by official spokespeople as misinterpretations. Yet those who had seen them knew otherwise. In the shadows, governments prepared. Satellites were repositioned, missile systems recalibrated, space agencies placed on high alert. Yet none dared admit the truth, to acknowledge what Atlas had been, to reveal that humanity was perhaps witnessing not the death of a comet, but the arrival of something greater, was to shatter the illusion of control that kept order in fragile societies. And so they lied, because lies were easier than terror. But as the fragments drew closer, pulsing with the remnants of a heartbeat that would not die, secrecy became more dangerous than truth. For no government, no shadowed agency, no classified report could stop what was already in motion. Atlas had spoken in silence, split into shards that carried its message forward. And now, those governments in shadow could only watch, powerless, as the heavens prepared to deliver whatever came next. The silence governments tried so carefully to enforce could not hold forever. When fragments of 3I divided by Atlas grew brighter, visible even to backyard telescopes and wide-angle lenses, the story leapt from hushed scientific circles into the chaotic arena of global media. What began as scattered reports on astronomy blogs and amateur skywatching forums erupted into a full storm of coverage, consuming headlines, talk shows, podcasts, and late-night broadcasts. Suddenly, the comet that officials insisted had no risk became the most talked-about object in the world. At first, the tone was awed. Networks ran dramatic footage of glowing streaks captured against night skies in Chile, Australia, and Arizona. Anchors described the event as a once-in-a-civilization spectacle, comparing it to Halley's Comet or the Tunguska Mystery, but grander, stranger, more profound. Scientists were interviewed live, many of them still sticking to rehearsed lines. Cometary breakup, expected behavior, fascinating but harmless. Yet cracks soon appeared in the narrative. Some experts, pressed too hard by journalists, faltered. They hesitated when asked why the fragments pulsed, why their trails curved into spirals, why data from multiple observatories had gone mysteriously missing. Those hesitations became fuel. Within days, contradictions exploded across headlines. One article claimed European researchers had recorded coherent signals from the fragments. Another leaked memo from South America suggested at least 3 shards were on paths intersecting Earth's orbit. When governments denied the claims, the denials only sharpened suspicion. Commentators asked, if there is no danger, why classify documents? Why scrub data? Why silence scientists? The storm fed upon itself, each unanswered question birthing a dozen more. Talk shows speculated wildly. Some framed Atlas as a harbinger of doom, invoking ancient prophecies about stars falling from heaven. Others mocked the hysteria, calling it the alien panic of the decade. Yet even the skeptics could not deny the strangeness. Footage circulated online showing synchronized flickers across multiple fragments, captured by amateurs from different continents at the same time. If this is natural, one popular commentator asked during a live broadcast, why does it look like they're signaling to each other? Social media became a battlefield of theories. Hashtags like number Atlas fragments and number comet message trended globally. Conspiracy forums claimed the explosion was a staged event by shadow governments or secret space programs. UFO communities declared Atlas the long-awaited proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. Meme culture twisted the fear into humor, but even jokes carried unease, spreading the story to millions who had otherwise ignored it. The comet was everywhere on screens, in conversations, in the restless dreams of those who stared too long at the night sky. Journalists dug deeper, unearthing inconsistencies in government statements. A Freedom of Information request revealed internal emails from a space agency warning staff to avoid the word signal in all communications. Another investigation uncovered satellite logs showing unexplained power fluctuations aligned with the fragment's pulses. The pieces formed a mosaic too large to ignore. Something was happening, and officials were not telling the truth. The media storm intensified as eyewitness accounts poured in. Pilots described compasses briefly spinning during flights over the Pacific. Sailors claimed their radios hummed with strange static when the fragments passed overhead. In remote villages, with little light pollution, people reported the sky itself beating like a drum, as if the stars had begun to pulse with Atlas's rhythm. Whether exaggerations or truth, these stories spread faster than verification could keep pace. For Ravi and Eliza, the storm brought both vindication and despair. The world was finally paying attention, but it was paying attention chaotically, through noise and rumor, through 1,000 voices shouting at once. The carefully measured work of scientists was drowned beneath headlines and talk shows, and yet neither could deny the urgency it created. Humanity was awake now, staring upward with the same dread and wonder they had felt for months. Governments scrambled to regain control of the narrative, holding press conferences filled with reassurances. But their smiles looked forced, their voices strained, and the public noticed the storm could no longer be contained. For the first time since Atlas had entered Earth's skies, the story no longer belonged to the watchers in observatories or the officials in shadowed rooms. It belonged to the world, to every human who lifted their eyes and saw glowing fragments moving across the darkness, silent and deliberate, like an omen no one could ignore. The storm was not just of news or speculation, it was a storm of attention, a collective gaze fixed on the heavens, and though no one yet knew it, that attention was exactly what Atlas had seemed to demand from the beginning. The storm of headlines and government denials might have remained abstract, a battle of words and data far from ordinary lives, if not for the eyes of the unlikely. While governments tried to control the narrative, and professional observatories were increasingly censored or infiltrated by shadowed agencies, it was the amateurs, the backyard skywatchers, the tinkerers with second-hand telescopes, the enthusiasts with cameras duct-taped to tripods, who began to capture the images no one was supposed to see. In rural Australia, a retired schoolteacher named Martin spent his nights pointing a modest telescope toward the heavens. He had no access to classified files, no government-grade instruments, only patience and stubbornness. When he photographed the Atlas fragments one cloudless night, he noticed something strange. Two shards pulsing in alternating rhythm, like a pair exchanging signals across emptiness. He uploaded the images to an astronomy forum, expecting curiosity at best. Within hours, the thread exploded. Others from Chile, Canada, and South Africa posted their own captures, showing the same phenomenon. The images were grainy, imperfect, but together, they told a story no official channel could erase. In Poland, a group of university students cobbled together a makeshift radio array using scrap metal and salvaged electronics. They recorded faint signals emanating from the direction of the Atlas fragments, bursts of static that repeated with uncanny regularity. They streamed their findings live on social media, the feed attracting thousands of viewers within hours. Their laughter at first was nervous, self-deprecating, but when the signals repeated, unmistakably patterned, their faces turned pale. The video spread virally before authorities could shut it down. By then, the world had already seen it. In Nigeria, a farmer walking home after dusk noticed the sky shimmering with green light. He pulled out his phone, capturing a streak of fragments that seemed to twist unnaturally, bending toward one another as though tethered. His footage, shaky but raw, spread through WhatsApp groups before reaching mainstream networks. Unlike official footage, it was untouched, unsanitized. People trusted it because it was ordinary, because it came not from scientists or governments, but from someone who had simply looked up. And in Japan, a young girl pointed her small telescope skyward and drew what she saw. Her sketches showed fragments forming arcs, spirals, diamonds, the same shapes Eliza had been scrawling feverishly in her notebooks. The drawings, posted online by her father, were dismissed by some as childish imagination. But when professional astronomers compared them to actual telescopic images, the resemblance was too exact to ignore. Even a child, innocent of equations and data, had seen the patterns. The unlikely witnesses multiplied. Fishermen, farmers, students, retirees all became chroniclers of a sky that refused to hide. They uploaded photographs, sketches, recordings, their collective observations forming a mosaic that no single authority could control. Governments issued statements dismissing the images as lens artifacts or signal interference, but the denials rang hollow. How could so many people, across so many continents, see the same patterns? The effect was profound. Trust shifted away from institutions and toward the voices of ordinary observers. News anchors began interviewing amateur astronomers alongside professionals. Forums once considered fringe became hubs of collaboration, where backyard scientists compared notes with astonishing rigor. For the first time, the global gaze of humanity was democratized. The sky belonged not to agencies or elites, but to everyone who could look up. For Ravi and Eliza, this shift was bittersweet. Their own work, hidden beneath layers of redaction and suppression, was now being echoed by people with no credentials, no degrees, but the same relentless curiosity. Ravi watched in awe as a group of hobbyists in South America accurately predicted the trajectory of one fragment using little more than persistence and open-source software. "They've done what half the labs won't publish," he muttered, almost laughing at the absurdity. But behind the wonder was unease. The more the fragments revealed themselves to ordinary witnesses, the harder it became to deny their strange behavior, and as the images spread, a new narrative began to form, not one of harmless cosmic debris, but of intention. The unlikely witnesses had, without meaning to, ripped away the last veil of secrecy. The fragments were aligning, signaling, moving with purpose, and the world could see it. What had once been whispers in observatories and shadows in government halls was now a roar across the internet, on phones and screens in living rooms worldwide. The witnesses had shown humanity the truth. Atlas had not died. It had multiplied, and its shards were still speaking in a language no one yet understood. And as night after night brought new images, new signals, new patterns, one realization spread through the hearts of those who watched. This was no longer a story of scientists or governments. This was a story of all humanity, and the sky was writing it in letters of fire. The fragments of Atlas were expected to scatter like shrapnel, fading into harmless dust as gravity and solar winds tore them apart. Instead, they became actors in a silent choreography that defied probability. Observatories, amateurs, and even children's sketches began to reveal the same unsettling truth. Amid the apparent chaos of their dispersal, there were patterns clear, deliberate, and persistent. At first, scientists resisted the idea. Natural processes could produce apparent alignments. The human mind, hungry for order, could impose geometry on randomness. Yet night after night, the evidence mounted. Telescopes across continents captured fragments, arranging themselves in arcs, spirals, even lattices. Two shards would drift toward one another, orbit briefly, then drift apart again in mirrored paths. Four others aligned in a perfect diamond, held their formation for several hours, then released into new trajectories. No matter how the data was parsed, the probability of coincidence dwindled into impossibility. The patterns extended beyond mere position. Their pulses, those faint, rhythmic flickers of light recorded since before the explosion, were no longer random intervals. When plotted side by side, they formed sequences, repeating loops that mirrored across fragments separated by millions of kilometers. Some astronomers described it as a choir, each shard emitting its own tone, together weaving a harmony of signals. Others, unnerved, called it a code. Eliza sat in her dim office, notebooks spread before her like a map of obsession. She had sketched the alignments night after night, overlaying them until a larger shape emerged. It resembled a spiral galaxy, yet distorted, compressed, as though viewed from an unfamiliar angle. She traced the lines with trembling hands, whispering, "It's a diagram. It has to be." Her colleagues dismissed it as overinterpretation, but she could feel the truth in her bones. The fragments were not random debris. They were pieces of a message, perhaps even instructions. Ravi, thousands of miles away, reached a similar conclusion by different means. Exhausted from endless simulations, he began to feed the pulse intervals into pattern recognition algorithms. The output shocked him. The signals bore mathematical ratios, identical to those found in orbital resonances, the same patterns that governed moons around planets, or planets around stars. It was as if the fragments were imitating celestial mechanics on a smaller, artificial scale. "They're teaching us something," he whispered into the empty lab. "But what?" Meanwhile, amateurs once again played a role no government could suppress. In Brazil, a group of friends stitched together long exposure photographs from 3 consecutive nights, revealing a lattice that resembled a geometric net stretched across the heavens. In Germany, a father and daughter compared radio bursts from their backyard array with optical data, discovering that the light pulses and radio emissions aligned with uncanny precision. These findings spread online, shared not as speculative theories but as undeniable evidence. Patterns were everywhere, and they were growing clearer. Governments responded with desperation. Press releases framed the alignments as optical illusions or gravitational clustering. Officials insisted that comets often fragmented in ways that appeared unusual, that there was no reason to suspect anything more. But their reassurances rang hollow. The very act of denial only amplified suspicion. Journalists highlighted contradictions, and leaked documents confirmed that military agencies were modeling the patterns as if they were intentional. The narrative of randomness had collapsed. Among the public, fascination mingled with dread. Social media filled with diagrams, overlays, and amateur theories. Some saw sacred geometry, others alien communication, others the harbinger of catastrophe. Artists turned the alignments into murals and songs. Conspiracy forums declared them signals of invasion. The world no longer looked at the sky with idle wonder. Every fragment was now a glyph, every pulse a syllable in a language humanity was only beginning to decipher. And still, the fragments moved, patient and deliberate. Their alignments did not linger long enough for absolute certainty, as if to taunt those who watched. Patterns emerged, dissolved, then reformed in new shapes. It was not chaos, not order, but something in between, a design glimpsed only in motion, like constellations that shifted faster than the eye could track. For those who truly watched, the realization became unavoidable. The fragments were not drifting aimlessly. They were writing something in the sky, a script too vast for any one observer to comprehend. The patterns in the chaos were not accidents. They were intentions revealed in fragments of light, messages carried not in words but in the very dance of matter itself. And though humanity struggled to read them, one truth was becoming clear. Atlas had not ended in its explosion. It had only transformed, scattering its pieces across the solar system to continue its silent, deliberate performance. The message was unfolding, piece by piece, and Earth was caught within its lines. As the fragments of Atlas carved their patterns into the heavens, a new tension settled across Earth, an unspoken, universal awareness that something was approaching. Scientists could no longer dismiss the alignments as coincidence, and governments could no longer control the narrative. The world had entered a vigil, waiting for an arrival no one could define. It was the longest night humanity had ever known, not measured in hours, but in the stretch of weeks where every eye seemed drawn upward, watching the sky with a mixture of awe and dread. The first to sense the change were those who lived under dark skies. In deserts, mountains, and oceans far from city lights, the fragments blazed with eerie brilliance, pulsing steadily as though reminding humanity of their presence. Farmers rose from their beds in the middle of the night to stand in silence with their families, watching streaks of green-white light cross the horizon. Sailors charting courses beneath unfamiliar stars whispered prayers to gods they had forgotten, uneasy at how the fragments seemed to move with purpose rather than drift. For them, the sky was no longer a backdrop, it was alive. Urban populations, shielded by light pollution, caught only glimpses, the brighter fragments cutting through haze, the strange flickers recorded on smartphones. Yet even in cities, the atmosphere thickened with unease. News networks broadcast live feeds from observatories, their commentators filling the silence with speculation. At first, the reports were cautious. Then came the leaks, Several fragments were on paths that would bring them perilously close to Earth's orbit. The risk of impact was low, officials repeated, but not zero. The word impact, once whispered only in classified meetings, now seeped into living rooms, gnawing at collective sleep. Nations prepared in secret, but whispers of their actions leaked into the storm of speculation. Satellite constellations were quietly repositioned, missile systems recalibrated, deep space probes redirected to intercept the brighter shards. None of these preparations were admitted publicly, but the truth revealed itself in strange ways: unexplained launches, sudden gaps in flight corridors, cryptic press releases about routine tests. People sensed what was happening. Governments were not waiting, they were bracing. For Ravi, the long night was suffocating. His days blurred into each other, an endless cycle of simulations, recalculations, and unanswered questions. Each model he ran seemed to collapse under the fragment's shifting behavior. "They aren't following physics," he muttered again and again, his voice hoarse, his hands trembling. His colleagues tried to soothe him, but many felt the same. They were watching something that rewrote the rules they had built their lives upon. Eliza fared little better. Her notebooks had become crowded with spirals and lattices, each drawing darker, more desperate than the last. She dreamed of the fragments, of their pulses echoing in her chest. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night, convinced she could feel their rhythm vibrating in her bones. She tried to ground herself in science, to calculate, to measure, but the patterns mocked her. They were too perfect to be chance, too fleeting to hold. "It's a language," she whispered to herself one night. "But what if it's not meant for us to read?" For ordinary people, the long night was lived in silence and tension. Families gathered on rooftops, lovers held hands in fields, children pressed their noses to windows, all staring upward. Fear mingled with wonder. If these were omens of destruction, they were beautiful ones. If they were messages, they were written in light and geometry far more profound than human words. Humanity waited together, unified not by answers but by uncertainty. And as the fragments drew closer, the pulses intensified. Radios hummed with static even when switched off. Seismographs twitched with tremors not of Earth's making. Magnetometers spiked in time with the shard's flickers. The long night was not only visual, it was felt in machines, in bodies, in dreams. A vibration in the marrow of existence itself. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It was anticipation, the unbearable stillness before revelation. The long night stretched on, humanity caught between awe and terror, knowing something was about to arrive yet powerless to hasten or halt it. For centuries, humanity had looked at the stars as a source of comfort, of wonder, of timelessness. But now the stars were no longer still. They were moving, speaking, shaping themselves into messages humanity could not yet decipher. And in that long night, one truth settled across the world like a weight. The universe was no longer indifferent. It was aware, it was present, and it was watching back. The long night did not end with fire, nor with silence, but with realization. As the fragments of 3I divided by Atlas pulsed across the heavens, their alignments tightening and dissolving like phrases in a vast, untranslatable text, humanity began to understand, not in detail, not in certainty, but in essence. Something had changed, not only in the sky but in the human heart. Atlas had rewritten the relationship between Earth and the cosmos. The shift was not in data alone, but in perception, in the trembling awareness that humans were no longer spectators in an indifferent universe. For centuries, science had taught that the cosmos was vast, cold, and mechanical, its beauty lying in its indifference. Stars burned, planets circled, comets wandered, all obeying immutable laws. But the fragments had shattered that comfort. Their rhythms, their alignments, their coherent signals spoke of intention, if not intelligence, then at least design. Humanity, long convinced of its solitude, now faced the possibility that it had been observed, perhaps even addressed. And once that possibility lodged itself in the collective consciousness, it could not be dislodged. In observatories, scientists stopped asking if Atlas had been natural. The evidence against randomness was overwhelming. Instead, they debated what kind of thing it had been. Was it a machine? A vessel designed to traverse the gulfs between stars? Was it a message? A container of patterns meant to awaken only upon meeting a new sun? Or was it something stranger still, a hybrid of natural and artificial, a structure grown rather than built, alive in a way human definitions could not grasp. No answer satisfied, but the act of questioning itself marked a shift. The old framework of understanding was no longer enough. For Ravi, the shift came late at night, when exhaustion blurred thought into revelation. He stared at pulse sequences until his eyes burned, until suddenly they no longer looked like data but like music. The ratios matched harmonic intervals, the same principles that governed resonance in strings and air columns. The fragments were not just moving, they were singing. He wept, not from fear but from the terrible beauty of it, the thought that perhaps Atlas had never meant to threaten, but simply to be heard. Eliza, meanwhile, found herself consumed by the geometry of the alignments. When she overlaid her sketches, she realized they resembled not only galaxies, but also ancient human symbols, spirals carved into stones, patterns found in petroglyphs, echoes across cultures that had never spoken to one another. Could it be coincidence? Or had humanity been seeing, remembering, fragments of this message long before Atlas arrived? She did not know. But the thought reshaped her understanding of history, of memory, of the strange correspondence between the human mind and the stars above. The public, too, felt the shift. In cities and villages alike, people gathered nightly to watch the fragments glow. Conversations once reserved for scientists became matters of common debate. Was Atlas alive? Was it a sign? Was it a warning? For some, it was proof of faith, a cosmic confirmation that humanity was not alone. For others, it was terror, the end of certainty, the crumbling of the old belief in human primacy. Whatever the interpretation, one fact was clear: the world would never look at the night sky the same way again. Governments could not suppress this change. Their denials sounded hollow, their reassurances irrelevant. For once, power slipped from their grasp. The shift was too deep, too personal, too universal. It spread not through documents or decrees, but through the simple act of looking upward. Every child who saw the fragments pulse, every old man who traced the alignments with trembling fingers, every woman who felt the rhythm in her bones, they all carried the shift within them. A truth larger than nations, larger than science, larger than fear. And yet, amid this transformation, unease remained. For if Atlas had been a message, what was it saying? If it was a design, who or what was its designer? If it was alive, what did it want? Understanding had shifted, but not settled. Humanity had crossed a threshold, glimpsed a larger cosmos, but the questions that opened were heavier than any answers. Still, the shift mattered. It was the end of an old era, the age of believing the stars were silent. Atlas had shattered that silence. Whether by accident or by intent, whether as messenger or warning, it had shown humanity that the universe was neither indifferent nor empty. The fragments glowed like lanterns scattered across the sky, reminders that the cosmos contained stories larger than human imagination. And as the long night stretched on, the shift deepened. No one could claim certainty anymore, but no one could claim ignorance either. Humanity had been shaken awake. Its gaze turned outward not in idle wonder but in recognition. The shift in understanding was irreversible. Atlas had spoken, and the echo would never fade. The fragments of Atlas drifted on, their glow softening as they scattered deeper into the solar system, but the impression they left upon Earth did not fade. Humanity had survived the long night, endured the shockwave, argued over theories, and borne witness to alignments that defied reason. Yet when the fragments finally slipped beyond easy visibility, fading into the vast silence from which they had come, the world was left with something heavier than fear, more enduring than wonder, questions that would not end. In scientific halls, debates raged without resolution. Some argued that Atlas had been a natural comet behaving in ways not yet understood. They pointed to volatile ices, solar resonance, chaotic mechanics, stretching known laws to their breaking point in order to preserve them. Others refused to cling to the comfort of old models. To them, the evidence was undeniable. The pulses, the geometry, the shockwave. Atlas had been more than stone and ice. It had been built, or grown, or shaped. But by whom? By what? And for what purpose? The silence of its fragments carried no answers, only echoes. For Ravi, the question took the form of sleepless nights spent replaying the harmonic ratios of the pulses. They haunted him, like half-remembered melodies, always on the edge of meaning. He began to believe they were not a message to decode, but a presence to experience. It wasn't speaking to us, he whispered to a colleague one evening. It was simply being, and we happened to hear. Yet even that thought led to further questions. If Atlas was simply existing, what kind of existence was this? What kind of universe contained such beings? Eliza, her notebooks overflowing with spirals and lattices, felt the questions pierce deeper still. The patterns she had traced from the fragments matched symbols carved into stones, painted on cave walls, repeated across cultures separated by oceans and centuries. Had humanity seen Atlas before? Had our ancestors glimpsed its cousins in the skies of antiquity? And if so, had those visions shaped myth, religion, even language? The thought chilled her, not because it frightened her, but because it suggested humanity had always been part of a dialogue it did not know it was having, a dialogue with the stars themselves. The public, too, carried the questions. In villages where the fragments had burned faintly overhead, children still spoke of the singing stars. In cities where news screens had broadcast the debates, people argued in cafes, in classrooms, in the quiet moments before sleep. Was Atlas a warning, a message, a probe, a relic of something greater, drifting through time? Some chose to weave it into prophecy, others into science fiction, others into philosophy. But none could ignore it. Even those who dismissed it as overblown found themselves looking up at the night sky with a lingering doubt. If Atlas had been real, and it had, then what else waited beyond the veil of stars? Governments, for all their secrecy, could not silence the endless question either. Classified files remained hidden. Satellites continued to track the faintest shards, but even within their secure chambers, officials admitted privately what they could not say aloud. Atlas had shaken certainty. It had reminded them, in ways brutal and undeniable, that human control was fragile, temporary, perhaps even illusory. Whatever Atlas had been, it had not asked permission to arrive, nor to speak, nor to shatter. It simply had. And in its wake, even power itself felt smaller. In time, the fragments faded. Some drifted outward, some inward. A few burned faintly in the atmosphere, streaking across the sky in fire that startled those who saw it. The spectacle ended as all things do, leaving behind absence. Yet the absence was louder than the presence had been. It filled every silence with wonder and fear, reminding humanity that something vast had brushed against its world and moved on, leaving only questions behind. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of Atlas. Not answers, not destruction, not salvation, but questions too large to silence, too vast to ignore. The kind of questions that wake civilizations from complacency, that turn eyes upward for generations. The kind of questions that do not end. Was Atlas an accident or a message? Was it a relic of a civilization long gone, or the first whisper of one still watching? Did it come to warn, to teach, to test, or simply to remind us we are not alone? No one knew. No one would ever know. And so humanity lived beneath a sky forever changed, watching stars with new eyes, wondering if somewhere out there another Atlas was already on its way. The silence of space was no longer empty. It was a silence full of meaning, full of weight, full of the endless question that would haunt every generation to come. What was it? And why did it come to us?